Chapter 2 Amaterasu, Queen of the High Plane of Heaven. Part 1 The Sun, Goddess and Her Domain. Why Amaterasu matters. Before we tell Amaterasu's story, we need to understand what she represents, because she is not simply the sun, in the way that Apollo is the sun, or Ra is the sun. She is something more layered and more interesting than that. Amaterasu is the ancestral deity of the Japanese imperial family. This is not a metaphor. It is not a poetic description. It is a claim that was taken literally, politically, legally, spiritually, for most of Japanese history, and that continues to have formal ceremonial acknowledgement today. The Emperor of Japan, in the Shinto tradition, is a direct descendant of Amaterasu, separated from her by dozens of generations, but connected by an unbroken genealogical line. What this means practically is that the story of Amaterasu is also the story of the legitimacy of Japanese imperial governance. The Kojiki and Nihon Shoki were commissioned by the imperial court not simply as literary or religious projects, but as political documents. They were establishing, in sacred narrative form, the divine origin and divine right of the imperial line. Amaterasu is the source of that line. Her character, her choices, her attributes reflect, and were deliberately shaped to reflect, the ideal of divine sovereignty. She is also the center of Japan's most important religious site. The grand shrine of Ise, in what is now Mie Prefecture, is dedicated to Amaterasu. It is the holiest site in Shinto, receiving millions of pilgrims each year, and it has been a pilgrimage destination for well over 1,000 years. The shrine complex is rebuilt entirely every 20 years, a practice called Shikinen Sengu, which we will return to at the end of this video. It is not simply a shrine dedicated to a sun deity. It is the spiritual home of Japanese civilization's most fundamental claim about itself, that the land and its people stand in a special relationship with the divine light. Modern Japan. The most recent Shikinen Sengu, the ritual rebuilding of Ise Grand Shrine, took place in 2013 and will occur again in 2033. The ceremony involves over a decade of preparation, including the planting and harvesting of specific sacred cypress trees. At its conclusion, a procession of priests transfers the divine presence of Amaterasu from the old shrine to the new one, in a ceremony conducted entirely in darkness. Even the emperor participates, formally announcing the transfer. It is one of the most elaborate and expensive religious ceremonies conducted anywhere in the modern world. The realm of heaven. What Amaterasu built, the high plane of heaven, as Amaterasu ruled it, was not a passive paradise. It was a working kingdom. The Kojiki is careful to show us Amaterasu as an active administrator, not a passive symbol. She cultivated sacred rice paddies, the Tanada, the terraced fields that are still one of the defining visual elements of the Japanese landscape. She oversaw the divine weaving halls where cloth was made. These might seem like mundane activities for a supreme deity. But in the context of ancient Japanese civilization, they were anything but mundane. Rice cultivation was the foundation of the economy, the calendar, the social structure, and the religious year. The planting and harvesting of rice was itself a sacred act, connected to the divine and governed by ritual. When Amaterasu grows rice in heaven, she is modeling the correct relationship between human beings and the land. The attentive, productive, reciprocal relationship between people and the forces that sustain them. Similarly, cloth making. The weaving of cloth was, in ancient Japan, women's sacred work connected to the divine feminine, to fertility, to the ordering of the world. Amaterasu's weaving hall is a site of divine labor that mirrors the labor of human women. The goddess does not only reign, she works, alongside her attendants, at the same crafts that sustain civilization. This is an Amaterasu who is not distant and transcendent, but immediate and engaged. She is in the fields. She is in the weaving hall. She is managing, organizing, producing. And it is this engaged, attentive quality that makes what her brother does to her domain so particularly devastating. Part 2. Susanoo's Crisis and the Catastrophe. The god who could not stop weeping, Susanoo had been given the seas to rule. He had been handed dominion over one of the most powerful forces in the natural world, the oceans that surround Japan, that both protect it and threaten it, that bring fish and trade winds and occasionally devastating typhoons. This was not a small assignment. But Susanoo could not do it. He would not do it. He sat in his appointed realm and wept, and his weeping was not quiet or contained. It was cosmic. His grief shook the mountains. The sound of his mourning was so vast and so raw that it withered the forests on the hillsides. The seas he was supposed to govern instead took on the character of his internal state, churning, unpredictable, violent. Evil spirits were drawn to the disorder his grief created, and they ran wild across the earth, causing plague and drought and disaster. What was he mourning? His mother, Izanagi, who had died giving birth to the fire god who lay in the darkness of Yomi. Susanoo had never known her. He had been born from his father's purification ritual, after Izanagi was already dead and sealed away. He had lost her before he ever had her, and yet the loss was real, perhaps more real in some ways, for its totality. You cannot grieve someone you knew. You can only grieve what you never had. Izanagi appeared before his inconsolable son and confronted him. Why will you not rule as I commanded? Why does the world suffer for your grief? And Susanoo said with terrible simplicity, I don't want the seas. I want to go to my mother. I want to go to the land of Yomi. This was not acceptable. Izanagi, who had himself descended to Yomi and barely escaped, who had sealed the entrance with a boulder and accepted the divorce of the living world from the dead one. He would not send his son to Yomi. He would not hear this wish. He banished Susanoo from his domain and from his presence. If the seas mean nothing to you, then go. Leave this realm. You are no longer welcome here. Susanoo accepted the banishment, but he needed, before leaving, to say goodbye to his sister. The contest, a trial of intentions. As Susanoo began his ascent to the high plane of heaven, the mountains and seas registered his approach with violence. The divine world responds to the emotional state of its deities. The physical world is not separate from the psychological one. Susanoo's grief turned resolve turned uncertainty, manifested as geological upheaval. Amaterasu felt it. She knew her brother was coming, and she was afraid. Not the abstract fear of a distant threat, but the immediate, tactical fear of a ruler who suspects invasion. She had watched what Susanoo's grief had done to the world below. She knew the scale of his power uncontrolled. Was this an assault? Was he coming to take her realm from her? She prepared for war. She bound her hair up into the warrior's style, into knots at either temple, the way a fighting man would wear it. She slung a quiver of 1,000 arrows across her back. She took up a bow. She let her presence expand to fill the approach to heaven, enormous, radiant, armed, waiting. When Susanoo arrived at the boundary of heaven, she was already there. State your purpose. Speak clearly. Why have you come here? Susanoo protested his innocence with evident frustration. I come to say goodbye. I have been banished, and I will go. But I wanted to see you first, and my heart is clear. I am not here to take anything from you. But how does a god prove that his heart is clear? How does anyone prove that their intentions are pure? They struck an agreement, a divine contest, a trial by creation. They would produce gods together, and the nature of those gods would reveal whose intentions were what they claimed to be. Amaterasu took Susanoo's sword, the 10-span blade, broke it into 3 pieces, chewed the pieces and breathed mist. 3 goddesses emerged from that mist. 3 divine women, born from Susanoo's sword but created by Amaterasu's creative act. She declared them hers. Susanoo took Amaterasu's jewels, the necklace their father had given her, washed them, chewed them, and breathed mist. 5 gods emerged. 5 divine men, born from Amaterasu's jewels but created by Susanoo's breath. He declared them his. Both claimed victory. Both could make an argument for it. The Kojiki, unusually, does not fully adjudicate between them. Different scholars read the contest differently. What matters, for the narrative, is what Susanoo does next. Scholars note, the 3 goddesses born from Susanoo's sword during this contest are Takiribime, Ichikishima Hime, and Takitsu Hime. They are venerated today at the Munakata Grand Shrine in Fukuoka Prefecture, one of the most sacred sites in Japan. The shrine complex, on 3 islands in the sea between Japan and Korea, was designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 2017. The islands themselves are so sacred that women are prohibited from landing on the main island, and even male visitors must undergo a purification ritual in the sea before setting foot on land. The rampage, perhaps it was the vindication, perhaps the sense that he had been proven right, that his intentions were pure, that his sister had doubted him unfairly, released something in Susanoo that had been held under pressure for too long. Whatever the cause, what followed was a sustained, systematic destruction of everything Amaterasu had built. He filled in the irrigation channels of her sacred rice paddies. He broke down the dividing boundaries between the fields. He scattered his own excrement through the halls where she held her most sacred ceremonies. He desecrated what was holy. He destroyed what had been carefully cultivated. And still, when Amaterasu first heard of it, she tried to find excuses for him. Perhaps, she said, he didn't mean to fill in the channels. Perhaps he thought it was more efficient. Perhaps the boundary breaking was an accident. Perhaps he didn't realize what he was doing in the sacred hall. She was trying, with what we might today call magical thinking, to hold the narrative together, to keep her brother's action within the realm of misunderstanding rather than malice. Then he flayed a horse. He took a piebald horse, a horse of mixed white and dark coloring, which in Japanese tradition has specific sacred associations, and he stripped the skin from it while it was alive. He carried the flayed carcass to the roof of the sacred weaving hall, broke open the roof, and hurled it inside. The weavers inside reacted in panic and chaos, as anyone would when a flayed horse comes through the roof. In the chaos, one of Amaterasu's devoted weaving maidens, a young woman who had dedicated her life to service in the divine hall, was fatally injured, struck by her own shuttle in the confusion of bodies and terror. In some versions of this story, it is Amaterasu herself who is injured, who strikes her own thigh with the shuttle in her panic. In others, the maiden is the one who dies. The texts diverge on this point, but the result in both tellings is the same. Amaterasu stopped making excuses. The damage was not a misunderstanding. The grief was not a justification. Her brother, for whatever reason, entitlement, release, the despair of a god who had never been given what he needed, had deliberately destroyed the things she had made and had caused the death of someone under her care. She was frightened, not of Susanoo directly, but of something deeper, of the uncontrollable, of the darkness that exists even in people you love, of the way grief can transform into violence without anyone noticing the moment of transformation. She had spent her existence maintaining light and order and cultivation, and she had just watched all three be unmade in an afternoon. She withdrew. The Amano Ewato, Heaven's Rock Cave, the Amano Ewato. Heaven's Rock Cave. Amaterasu retreated into it, and she pulled the stone door shut behind her, and the world went dark. Not the ordinary dark of night, which has its own beauty and its own light, the moon, the stars, the quiet luminescence of a world resting. This was something else, a darkness without gradation, without relief, without any suggestion that light had ever existed or would ever exist again. The sun had hidden herself. The source of all warmth and growth and orientation had gone somewhere the world could not follow. The Kojiki describes the consequences with escalating horror. The forests died. The crops failed. The seasons stopped functioning. No planting season, no harvest season, just undifferentiated cold and dark and the sound of things dying. And into this darkness came the evil spirits that Susanoo's grief had first stirred, now multiplied, emboldened, filling the emptiness left by the absence of light. They were everywhere. Their shrieks and their destructive energy went unchecked. The world was unraveling. The Yaoyorozu no Kami, the 8 million gods, a number meaning countless beyond counting, every divine being in existence, gathered in council on the bank of the Ame no Yasukawara, the tranquil riverbank of heaven. What could they do? The sun goddess had sealed herself inside a mountain. You cannot command a goddess. You cannot threaten her. You cannot argue her back into the world. They had to invite her. They had to make her want to come out. The dance, comedy, and the sacred. The gods devised a plan, or rather a kind of elaborate theatrical production. They hung the Yata no Kagami, the great 8-span mirror, in the branches of a sacred sakaki tree near the cave entrance. They draped the tree with jewels, with cloth of white and blue, with offerings accumulated from every corner of heaven. They brought roosters and set them crowing in the dark, as if conjuring a dawn. And then they asked Ame no Uzume to perform. Ame no Uzume is one of the most interesting figures in Japanese mythology, the goddess of dawn and of revelry and of the arts of performance. She is not a warrior, not a ruler, not a creator in the way Izanagi and Izanami are creators. She is something rarer and more subversive. She is a performer. And what she performed on that night outside the sealed cave changed the world. She climbed up onto an overturned wooden tub, a makeshift stage in the darkness outside Heaven's Rock Cave. And she began to dance. The dance began ritually, formally, the kind of sacred dance that might be performed at a shrine ceremony. But as the drumming picked up, and the gods watched, and the darkness pressed in from every side, something happened to the dance. It became something else. It became frenzied, ecstatic, improvisational, Ame no Uzumi's body moving in ways that went far beyond the formal ritual. Her robes loosened. Her movements grew wilder. She was, some scholars say, enacting a kind of divine possession, a trance state in which the boundaries between the human and the divine, between the sacred and the profane, between the cosmic and the comedic, completely dissolved. And the 8 million gods started laughing. A great, rolling, enormous, irrepressible laughter shook the high plane of heaven, the sound of countless divine beings overcome with uncontrollable mirth. In the middle of the greatest crisis the cosmos had ever faced, resonated across every corner of the divine realm. The absurdity of it. A goddess dancing with wild abandon in the pitch-dark outside a sealed cave while civilization collapsed was apparently just too much to contain. Inside the cave, Amaterasu heard it, and she was confused. She had retreated from a world in crisis. She had sealed herself away from grief and violence and fear. And what was happening outside her door was not the sound of a world suffering. It was the sound of laughter. Raucous, unstoppable, joyful laughter. How was this possible? How could there be laughter when the world was dark? Scholars note, the dance of Ame no Uzume is understood by many scholars to be the mythological origin of Kagura, the sacred dance that remains a living tradition in Shinto ceremonies throughout Japan today. Kagura performances are held at shrines during festivals, and they often incorporate elements of comedy alongside solemnity, echoing the original performance that brought the sun back to the world. The tradition has been unbroken for over 1,000 years. She moved to the stone door, opened it the smallest crack, just enough to peek out, just enough to ask, why? And in that moment, everything happened at once. Ame no Tajikarao, the strong-armed god who had been hiding flat against the rock face beside the door, coiled and waiting for exactly this moment, seized Amaterasu's hand, pulled. She stumbled out into the open. And before she could recover her balance and pull back, a rope, the shimenawa, the sacred rope, was stretched across the cave entrance. The door was sealed from the outside. There was no going back in. But Amaterasu wasn't thinking about going back in. She was staring at the sakaki tree. In the branches of that tree hung the yata no kagami, the great mirror, and in it she saw reflected back a figure of such radiance, such divine intensity, such overwhelming presence, that she could not look away. She was transfixed, awestruck. She had never seen anything like this, had never understood, perhaps, quite what she was, what she looked like, what she had always been. She was looking at herself, for the first time. In that moment of transfixed self-recognition, the world was flooded with light. The darkness dissolved. The evil spirits fled before the returning sun. The crops would grow again. The seasons would resume their cycle. Everything that had been interrupted was restored. The 8 million gods cheered. Modern Japan. The sacred mirror in this story, the yata no kagami, is one of the 3 imperial treasures of Japan, the most sacred objects in the Shinto tradition. It is believed to reside today within the innermost sanctum of the grand shrine of Ise, where it has been kept for over 2,000 years. It has never been publicly displayed. Even the Emperor of Japan is not permitted to view it directly. He sees only the box it is kept in. When it was moved during the most recent Shikinen Sengu ceremony in 2013, it was transported by priests in total darkness, wrapped in silk, its form never exposed to direct light or direct sight. The judgment of Susanoo. With Amaterasu back in her rightful place, the assembled gods turned to the cause of the catastrophe. Susanoo was tried. The judgment was not gentle. He was fined, an enormous number of objects extracted from him as punishment. His beard was cut off. His fingernails and toenails were pulled out. These acts might seem symbolic to us, but in the divine context, they represent a real diminishment, a stripping away of divine power and status. A god with his beard cut and his nails removed is a god who has been made lesser, made more mortal, made more human. And then he was expelled from the high plane of heaven permanently, cast down to the earth below to find whatever existence he could among the mortal world. He fell to earth in the province of Izumo. And here, something unexpected happened. The god who had destroyed sacred fields and defiled holy halls and driven the sun into hiding, arrived on earth and found himself at the beginning of a different story. A story not of destruction, but of redemption. Not of grief turning into violence, but of violence turning into protection. Not of the storm God ruining what others had built, but of the storm, God becoming the thing that stands between the helpless and what would consume them. His story was not finished. It was, in a strange way, just beginning.